I regret to say that this document is nothing more than an optical illusion. This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face.
It has been a difficult journey, but we've delivered a deal.
I withdrew the United States from the unfair and one-sided Paris Climate Accord.
For over 30 years, global climate financing has depended on a select group of wealthy nations to bear the financial responsibility of combating climate change. But as the climate crisis deepens and economic power shifts, so does the debate. Should today's largest economies and some of the world's biggest polluters start contributing to the climate fund?
I propose that the committee express its agreement and adopt the text and recommend it for signature at the next conference. Do you agree with those sentences that would appear in the report?
In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change established a set of financial obligations based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Under this principle, high-income countries with high historical emissions were expected to lead in providing climate finance for developing countries. This financial structure was grounded in the idea that those who contributed the most to global warming should be responsible for addressing its impacts. At the same time, emerging economies like China, India, and Brazil were largely exempted from such obligations as their focus was on economic development rather than on mitigating climate impacts. This created a divide, with the developed nations seen as responsible for funding mitigation and adaptation efforts in the developing world. Fast forward to the present day, and the global economic and emissions landscapes look drastically different. China, which was once seen as a developing country with minimal emissions, has grown into one of the world's largest economies, and its emissions reflect that. In fact, China is now the world's leading emitter of carbon dioxide, while other emerging economies like India and Brazil also contribute significantly to global emissions. Despite this shift, countries like China continue to hold onto their developing country status, which exempts them from certain financial responsibilities within the climate financing framework.
It has been a difficult journey, but we've delivered a deal. This new finance goal is an insurance policy for humanity amid worsening climate impacts hitting every country. But like any insurance policy, it only works if premiums are paid in full and on time.
As climate impacts worsen, a new line of thought has emerged. Should the donor base for climate financing be expanded to include these emerging economies, especially those with large carbon footprints? Advocates for this approach argue that this current system, based on historical responsibility, no longer reflects today's reality. An expanded donor base could help fill critical gaps in climate financing, which remain persistently underfunded despite ambitious pledges. With an expanded group of contributors, countries with low emissions but high vulnerability to climate change could receive more of the funds they need to adapt and build resilience.
If we prove that someone is responsible for something, it is its responsibility to pay for that, to find a solution for that. And this is the basis of the negotiation.
While the proposal to expand the donor base may sound reasonable to some, it has encountered resistance, particularly from China, which remains steadfast in its claim to developing nation status. China argues that it should not be held to the same financial standards as high-income nations with long history of emissions. This position highlights a fundamental tension in the climate financing debate. How do you balance historical responsibility with current capability? Should today's largest economies contribute more, or even if the emissions were lower in the past? China's insistence on retaining its developing nation status underscores a broader issue for many emerging economies. Leaders from these countries argue that, despite their growing economic stature, they still face significant developmental challenges and should not be burdened with financing global climate solutions at the expense of their own progress.
We are extremely disappointed.
As the debate intensifies, some suggest a compromise, a hybrid model for climate finance contributions. Under this approach, high-income countries would continue to lead with the largest financial contributions, while high-emitting emerging economies will be encouraged or even required to contribute in a more limited capacity. This approach will allow wealthy emerging economies to support global climate goals without diverting critical funds for their internal development needs. It will also make more funds available for the countries most vulnerable to climate change, which are often the least responsible for its causes. The outcome of this debate will shape the future of climate financing, and by extension, the success of global efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. The next decade is critical, as scientists warn that we must rapidly scale up funding for mitigation and adaptation if we hope to avoid worst impacts. If an expanded donor base is adopted, it would mean a significant increase in the funds available for climate action, especially in the world's most vulnerable regions. However, it will also require a shift in mindset among emerging economies, a recognition that their role in global action system has evolved. As this debate continues, the world faces a pivotal choice: stick to a model rooted in historical emissions, or embrace a more flexible, inclusive approach that reflects today's global economic and emissions landscape. The stakes couldn't be higher, but as nations deliberate, one thing remains clear: without adequate financing, the fight against climate change will falter. And in this battle, every dollar, every nation counts.